It was supposed to be a routine morning in Montgomery County, a sleepy Tuesday when sunlight filtered through courthouse windows and the air tasted like legal jargon and lukewarm coffee. But somewhere between the rustle of manila folders and the echo of leather shoes on marble tiles, injustice put on a uniform and walked in like it owned the place. Officer Greg Walters stood at the security checkpoint of Courtroom B, a tall man with a square jaw, a gleaming badge, and the kind of confidence that didn't come from competence, but entitlement. He wasn't just a cop. In his mind, he was the law. He glanced over a few people in the line, waving most of them through with half a nod. And then he saw her. A black woman in a slate gray dress, heels low but purposeful, a brown leather satchel hugged tightly under her arm. Her hair was coiled into a soft bun, her eyes unreadable behind thick-rimmed glasses. She looked calm and composed. Too composed, perhaps, for someone he didn't recognize. "Ma'am," he said, with a voice that didn't ask, it assumed. "This line's for attorneys. Defendants go to the other entrance." She didn't blink. "I am an attorney." Greg snorted, just loud enough for the clerk beside him to hear. "Right. And I'm the Chief Justice." She handed him a state bar ID. Clean. Current. Her name printed boldly in black ink, Amara Jennings, ESQ. He stared at it. Then back at her. Then back to the card. As if her skin color and credentials couldn't coexist in the same reality. People in line began to shift awkwardly. Silence swelled like pressure in a storm cloud. "Where did you get this?" he asked, fingers curling around the ID like it offended him. And just like that, a moment that could have passed quietly became something else. Amara didn't raise her voice. She didn't flinch. Her reply was soft, so soft it made the accusation louder by contrast. "I earned it. Just like you earned your badge. Or at least. I assume you did." A few people behind her stifled gasps. One man let out a low whistle. Greg's face flushed. Not from embarrassment, but from the fury of a man who felt challenged in his domain. "You want to get smart with me?" he growled. "No," she said, her voice still even. "I want to get to court. I have a client waiting." But Greg wasn't done. He leaned in. "Lady, I could detain you right now. One word, obstruction. You want to keep pushing." And that's when the hook sank in. Not just for Amara, but for the crowd. For the cameras on the ceiling. For the system watching, waiting, to see how a woman with nothing but her mind and her merit would face down power wrapped in arrogance. Because what Greg didn't know, and what the world was about to learn, is that Amara Jennings wasn't the one who was out of place. He was. And he'd just picked a fight with the wrong black woman, in the one room where truth still had a voice. It began with something as ordinary as a parking ticket. Officer Brent Wallace had been with the force for over 17 years. He wore his uniform like it was stitched from the Constitution itself, chest puffed, chin high, gaze narrow. In his eyes, his badge was more than just authority, it was identity. It granted him entry into rooms others were denied, gave his words weight that few dared question. Over time, that authority had hardened into something dangerous, entitlement. On a humid Wednesday morning, he parked outside a coffee shop in downtown Atlanta. The streets bustled with energy, vendors setting up booths, mothers rushing kids to school, and city workers chasing deadlines. Amid the noise, Officer Wallace's eyes fell on a black SUV parked slightly crooked on the curb. No visible handicap permit. Meter blinking red. He approached the car with the same swagger he used for years, already assuming the story before it unfolded. He scribbled down the license plate and began writing the citation. But as he leaned down, the door opened gently, and out stepped a woman. She was calm. Graceful. Not rushed or flustered. She wore a navy blue pantsuit with subtle gold cufflinks that glimmered when the morning sun caught them. Her name was Maya Ellis. Without even raising her voice, she addressed him. "Officer, good morning. That citation won't be necessary." Brent didn't look up. "You parked illegally. Step aside." Maya reached into her blazer and pulled out a thin wallet, not with money, but with a federal seal. Inside, the identification card read, "Maya L. Ellis, Civil Rights Attorney, United States District Court." For a moment, Brent hesitated. But his pride stepped forward faster than his reason. "Oh, you're one of those," he sneered. "One of what, officer?" Maya asked calmly. "The type who thinks a title gives you a pass." Maya's eyes locked with his, and she smiled, not smug, not hostile. "Just sure. I'm not looking for a pass. Just asking you to apply the law equally. If I were someone else, would you ask for the context? Maybe give a warning?" Brent folded the ticket, handed it to her anyway, and said, "If you've got a problem, take it to court. Let's see how far your badge gets you there." And with that, he walked off. Maya didn't chase him. She didn't yell. But something in her spine straightened. She knew this wasn't just about a ticket, it was about something much older, heavier, and more familiar than paper and ink. It was about how people with power choose to wield it. And in her gut, she knew, this isn't over. Back at the precinct, Brent laughed off the encounter with his colleagues. "Can you believe that woman tried to flash a federal ID at me? Like that makes her special." One of the newer officers looked up. "Wait, you mean Maya Ellis? Isn't she the civil rights attorney on the Thompson case?" Brent's smirk faded just a little. But arrogance, like rust, clings tight to the frame of a man who's never been challenged. 2 weeks later, the wheels of the system began to turn, slow, methodical, and indifferent. Brent Wallace received a formal court summons. At first, he waved it off, assuming it was a misunderstanding. After all, he had written thousands of tickets over the years. What made this one different? But when he saw the plaintiff's name, his smirk vanished. Maya L. Ellis. A storm brewed quietly inside him. Not fear, not yet, but a peculiar unease. The kind of chill you feel when you're halfway up a mountain and realize you never packed ropes. Still, he walked into the courtroom that Monday like he owned it. Shoes shined. Tie clipped. Chest puffed out with the inflated confidence of someone who believes consequences are for other people. The courtroom was modest. Pale wood, navy carpet, and a long row of mahogany benches. An old analog clock ticked with painful clarity. Every tick seemed louder than the last. Maya Ellis was already seated. Composed. Alone. She had no entourage, no assistants bustling about her. Just a calm, regal silence. Her presence filled the room not with volume, but with weight. Brent snorted under his breath. No lawyer with her. This'll be quick. He didn't yet understand. She didn't bring a lawyer, because she was the lawyer. The judge entered, a stern woman with silver hair tied into a bun, known across the circuit for her intolerance of nonsense and her unwavering commitment to justice. "Court is now in session," the bailiff announced. Case 1742, Ellis vs. Wallace. Brent didn't hear the gasps that came from the gallery when they realized who Ellis was. He was too busy planning his defense, deny, downplay, deflect. It had always worked before. Why would today be different? Judge Harmon looked over her glasses. "Ms. Ellis, are you representing yourself today?" Maya stood slowly, every motion deliberate and dignified. "Yes, Your Honor. With your permission." "Permission granted," the judge replied. "Proceed." The next 45 minutes were not what anyone in that room expected, especially Brent. Maya didn't raise her voice. She didn't dramatize or point fingers. She didn't need to. Her power was precision. She began with facts, dates, times, and legal context. Then came the citations of precedent, the inconsistencies in the citation process, and the quiet unveiling of a pattern. Not just a ticket. Not just one moment of bias, but a history. "Officer Wallace," she said during cross-examination, "how many citations did you issue in the past 12 months?" He shrugged. "I don't have the exact number." "I do," she said calmly, lifting a printed spreadsheet. "Your total was 326. Of those, 198 were issued to black drivers, 62%. Yet census data shows only 34% of the population in your patrol zone identifies as black." Brent shifted in his seat. "That doesn't mean anything." "Perhaps," she replied. "But when that disparity is paired with multiple complaints from citizens, documented here, alleging discriminatory remarks and disproportionate enforcement tactics, it starts to look less like coincidence, and more like conduct." The judge leaned forward. Brent's lawyer objected weakly, citing character relevance. "Overruled," Judge Harmon replied. "Pattern of behavior is relevant in civil rights claims." Brent's face grew redder with every word. He tried to speak. Maya held up a hand. "One last thing, Your Honor," she said. She pressed play on a short video clip submitted as evidence. The courtroom watched as Brent could be seen dismissing Maya with a wave, saying, "People like you always think you're above the law." The room went quiet. It was a short clip. Just 9 seconds. But silence has a sound when the truth lands like thunder. When the footage ended, Maya didn't say another word. She didn't need to. She simply returned to her seat, her spine straight, her eyes calm. Brent could feel the ground shifting. For the first time, the badge on his chest felt cold. Not like a shield, but like a weight. The judge called a recess. Outside the courtroom, whispers echoed like wildfire. "Maya Ellis," someone murmured. "That's the woman from the Supreme Court filing last year. She dismantled him in minutes. She's not just good, she's legendary." But Maya didn't linger to soak in admiration. She stepped out quietly and sat on a bench beneath the courthouse's faded emblem. She closed her eyes for a moment. Not in pride, but in stillness. Because she knew this wasn't just about winning. This was about the moment when power meets accountability. When silence becomes voice. When fear becomes law. The clip had been less than 10 seconds. But by the time the court reconvened an hour later, it had already been posted on 4 social media platforms, retweeted over 6,000 times, liked by 20,000, and shared by news bloggers who recognized the moment for what it was. A shift. "Who is she?" a young woman whispered in the gallery. "Did she just say she's Maya Ellis?" another asked. "She was the one who debated constitutional reform on that Senate panel," someone replied. "No," came another voice, "she clerked for a federal judge at 24. The air was no longer quiet. It was electric. Inside the courtroom, Brent Wallace's face had lost its arrogance. What once stood as unshakable pride had shriveled into defensive silence. The courtroom had grown tighter, not physically, but morally. The ground beneath him wasn't crumbling, it had already collapsed. He just hadn't realized it yet. Judge Harmon returned from recess with a face carved in stone. "We will proceed," she said, and her voice bore the clarity of law but the gravity of conscience. Maya stood once more. She didn't bask in the viral attention. She seemed untouched by it, focused solely on the integrity of the proceeding. Her tone didn't shift, her posture didn't change. What the world had just begun to see, she had carried in silence for years. "This case is not about revenge," she began. "It's about the quiet cost of unchecked authority. It's about the humiliation one feels when dismissed, not because of merit, but because of skin. It's about how power, without accountability, breeds not law, but fear. Brent's lawyer objected again. Relevance, Your Honor, this is turning into a speech. Judge Harmon didn't blink. It is relevant, counselor. Let her speak. The silence that followed was not silence at all, it was the attention of a nation. Maya walked slowly to the center of the courtroom. Her heels made no sound. Her presence did. I did not file this suit because I was disrespected, she said. I filed it because I was endangered. When a police officer abuses power, it's not just one person they threaten. It's the trust of every person who believes in justice. Her eyes locked onto Brent's. And when that abuse is allowed to stand, when it's excused, overlooked, or quietly buried beneath procedure, we tell the next little girl who looks like me that she's not safe, no matter how hard she works, how right she is, or how calm she remains. Brent couldn't look at her. Because for the first time, he saw himself, not as protector, but as predator. And more terrifying than judgment, more damning than evidence, was clarity. Judge Harmon asked if he wanted to testify. He declined. Of course he did. What could he say? She was right. That he never saw her as equal. That in the moment he waved her off and told her to watch her attitude, he didn't even register her humanity. He remained seated. The court recessed again for deliberation. And as Maya stepped outside the courthouse, her steps still measured, her expression still serene, camera crews were waiting. Reporters. Activists. Strangers who'd seen the video and driven hours just to stand outside and clap. She didn't pose. She didn't wave. She simply said, I believe the law is a promise. And today, I came to collect. That single sentence would become a headline across dozens of outlets. The law is a promise, and she came to collect. Her face appeared on everything from late-night political commentary to grassroots justice blogs. People who had never stepped inside a courtroom watched her testimony. Women. Young black girls. Single fathers. Public defenders. And for many, it wasn't just Maya they saw. It was the version of themselves they prayed would one day win, not with rage, but with reason. That night, Brent Wallace didn't sleep. His phone buzzed with messages from colleagues, none of them supportive. Internal Affairs had already launched an inquiry. The mayor's office had released a statement condemning the incident. And for the first time in his 17-year career, he realized something terrifying. The badge didn't make him untouchable. It had only ever disguised his accountability. The morning of the verdict, the courthouse wasn't just a building, it was a pulse. Lines wrapped around the marble steps. People arrived not because they were summoned, but because they needed to witness this. They came holding signs, holding hands, holding hope. Some came from nearby neighborhoods, where stories like Maya's were whispered behind closed doors. Others traveled miles, drawn not by a name, but by a possibility, that maybe, this time, the law would speak for the voiceless. Inside the courtroom, the energy was different. It wasn't combative. It was reverent. As Maya entered, she didn't wear power on her face. She wore clarity. Grace. That quiet strength that doesn't demand attention, but commands it anyway. Her legal team sat beside her, barely whispering. Even they, seasoned and sharp, understood something rare was unfolding. Judge Harmon returned to the bench. Her robe caught the soft lighting from the stained glass window behind her, framing her like a symbol older than the court itself. Law. Balance. Accountability. Everyone stood. This court has reached a decision, she said, her voice measured. And it will be delivered with the seriousness this moment deserves. Brent Wallace didn't rise. He couldn't. The weight of his silence was heavier than the badge he used to wear. The judge began. This court finds that Officer Wallace violated the plaintiff's civil rights under color of law. His actions were not only reckless but also exhibited a pattern of racial profiling and abuse of authority. The evidence presented, corroborated by video footage, testimony, and historical records, leaves no room for ambiguity. A murmur swept through the room. But Judge Harmon wasn't done. In addition to awarding damages to Ms. Ellis, this court is mandating that the local precinct undergo third-party oversight, with quarterly reports submitted to the state's Department of Civil Rights. Brent blinked rapidly. His lawyer fidgeted. Maya remained still. The judge continued. This isn't just a ruling. It's a reckoning. And with those words, the room didn't cheer. They breathed. For the first time in what felt like forever, people inhaled justice, and it didn't feel like smoke. It felt like air. Brent's eyes dropped to the desk. He didn't cry. But his silence was louder than any weeping. His badge had once been a shield. Now, it was a mirror. And for the first time, he had to see himself in it. Maya rose. Not out of triumph. Not for the cameras. But because it was time. She walked down the courtroom aisle not like someone who had won, but like someone who had withstood. Reporters swarmed. Flashes blinked. Microphones lunged forward. Maya, what do you want to say to Officer Wallace? Maya, do you forgive him? Maya, what's next for you? She raised a hand, not to stop them, but to still them. Then she spoke. I'm not here for revenge. I'm here for restoration. Not just for myself, but for the woman next time, the child next time, the man next time. The law did its job today. Let's make sure it keeps doing it tomorrow. A hush swept the courthouse steps. Then, applause. Not thunderous. Not for show. Just the kind of soft, swelling sound that says, we see you. We believe you. And maybe, we're better because of you. That afternoon, local news anchors described it as a milestone case. Civil rights groups called it a blueprint for justice. One editorial headline read, when the system met its reflection, and chose to change. But Maya? She went home. She brewed a cup of tea, changed into her softest hoodie, and sat by the window where light always hit her bookshelf just right. She didn't watch the news. She didn't scroll through the mentions. Instead, she journaled. Because some victories aren't for the world to applaud. They're for the soul to keep. And she knew, this wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of a better one. Justice doesn't echo in silence, it reverberates in lives. In the days that followed the courtroom decision, Maya Ellis's name began to surface in unlikely places. Not as a celebrity, not as a headline, but as a catalyst, a quiet flame that lit the corners of rooms where power used to hide. It started with a precinct. 3 blocks away from where Brent Wallace once patrolled with impunity, Officer Luis Ramirez, a father, a husband, a man torn daily between duty and doubt, stood in front of a mirror longer than usual. That morning, he buttoned his shirt more slowly. He replayed the court footage. Watched how Maya had stood, unarmored but unafraid, and realized something, silence was no longer an option. At roll call that day, he raised his hand, not to question orders, but to question culture. "Captain," he said quietly, "when was the last time we trained for empathy?" Silence followed. But it didn't stay. By week's end, the precinct had scheduled its first independent bias workshop in over a decade. Not because it was mandated. Because someone dared to ask. Maya's name never came up in that meeting. But she was in every word unspoken. In a high school social studies class across town, a teacher named Ms. Latrice Johnson stood before 30 teenagers. She had tears in her eyes and chalk on her fingers. "This," she said, tapping the board where Maya's face appeared in an article, "is what civic courage looks like." A student raised his hand, curious. But she's just one person, right? Ms. Johnson smiled. The kind of smile that hides generations of fights. Yes. And that's exactly how every movement begins. That day, the class didn't study ancient laws or outdated constitutions. They studied now. Maya's case became a student project. Then a podcast episode. Then a mural outside the cafeteria wall. It wasn't about idolizing her. It was about realizing she could be them. Far beyond city limits, an elderly woman in Birmingham scrolled through her phone with slow, practiced fingers. Her granddaughter had texted the link. Maya Ellis wins landmark civil rights case. She watched in silence. Tears didn't fall, but memories did. Memories of 1963. Of marches and dogs and hoses and hymns. Of sitting on buses, knowing the front seat meant confrontation. As Maya stood calmly on screen, the woman whispered to herself, "She walked the path we paved." Then she called her church group. And just like that, Maya's story reached pews and prayer circles and potlucks. It traveled on faith. Even inside walls made of concrete and steel, prisons, her story found its way in. An inmate named Devonte read the case in the corner of a communal library. He was in for theft. A conviction that weighed heavier than the crime. But Maya's story? It lit something he hadn't felt in years, worth. For the first time in forever, he wrote to his public defender. Not to beg for an appeal, but to offer his insight. "You should read this case. It's not about me. But it reminded me I still matter." In the city hall, council members debated legislation inspired by the case. Words like accountability, transparency, and civilian oversight, once viewed as threats, became blueprints. One councilwoman said, "It's no longer enough to applaud Maya Ellis. We have to legislate her courage." Policies were drafted. Committees formed. Some failed. Others passed. But momentum had entered the building, and that, no one could repeal. At a neighborhood coffee shop Maya once visited quietly, a barista scribbled something new on the community board. It didn't advertise a band or yoga, or a roommate request. It said, "Courage is contagious. Tell your truth." Maya did. Below it, people began pinning their notes. "I reported to my supervisor today. First time. Told my mom I needed help. She listened. I apologized to my neighbor." It's a start. The board filled within days. Not with fame. With freedom. And Maya? She didn't return to the courthouse. She didn't book interviews. She returned to her normal, except that nothing was normal anymore. One afternoon, she passed a little girl in the park. The girl stared at her as if recognizing something not quite nameable. Maya smiled. The girl approached quietly and asked, "Are you the lady from the phone videos?" Maya knelt. "I am." The girl looked down at her shoes, then whispered, "I want to be brave like you." Maya didn't say, "You can." She said, "You already are." Because that's what ripples do. They reach. They teach. They never stop at the first wave. Brent Wallace had always walked with the swagger of someone untouched by consequence. From the moment he pinned that silver badge to his chest, it wasn't just a job, it was a performance. A daily costume. A character that felt bigger than life and louder than the voice inside him. Behind the uniform, behind the "yes, sir," and "step out of the vehicle," was a man who had slowly forgotten how to be human. But when the gavel dropped in Maya Ellis's case, when the jury's unanimous decision rang through the courtroom like a bell tolling for the arrogant, Brent didn't just lose a case. He lost his armor. And without it, he was small. He sat in his apartment the next morning, not knowing whether it was sunrise or sunset. The blinds were drawn. The TV was off. His badge lay on the kitchen table, no longer glowing, just cold, like metal should be. It had once made him feel proud. Now it looked like evidence. His phone buzzed with news alerts. Civil rights attorney wins landmark case against Officer Brent Wallace. Community demands police reform after Ellis verdict. From badge to blame, what happens when power meets truth? He stopped counting headlines after 20. His voicemail was full, but not with support. You embarrassed us. Don't come back. I stood by you, man. But now? Even the precinct was quiet. No one returned his calls. No one answered his messages. The brotherhood he once boasted about dissolved faster than the ink on his suspension notice. For the first time in years, Brent Wallace felt what it was like to stand alone. Not in the tactical gear of justice, but in the raw silence of accountability. He didn't sleep that night. Instead, he replayed the confrontation in his mind. The courtroom. The jury. The look Maya gave him, not full of hatred, but disappointment. It was worse than rage. It made him feel less than a man. Less than a protector. Like a child caught in a lie. Why did I even, he whispered to the air. But the room had no answers. Only shadows. In the days that followed, reporters came to his door. He didn't answer. Protesters passed through his street. He closed his curtains. But guilt? Guilt moved in without asking. It unpacked in his bedroom. Slept beside him. Sat across from him at breakfast. It was in the mirror when he shaved, in the silence when he scrolled. He tried to block it with distractions, games, shows, food, but it lingered. Because guilt doesn't leave until it's faced. And Brent had no tools for facing himself. One afternoon, a letter arrived. No return address. Just his name. Inside was a single handwritten line. When the badge no longer defines you, who will you be? There was no signature. Just a silence more deafening than any siren. He stared at it for an hour. Then he did something he hadn't done in years. He cried. Not because he was the victim. But because, for the first time, he realized he wasn't. Weeks later, he showed up at a community listening circle. No cameras. No microphones. Just folding chairs and people. He didn't speak. He just listened. Listened to stories like Maya's. Stories of fear, of silence, of being pulled over and not knowing what version of a cop they'd meet. No one recognized him at first. Then someone pointed. Gasps. Murmurs. Tension. He raised his hands, not to defend, but to admit. I was one of them, he said. I wore the badge. I used the tone. I forgot what people looked like without fear in their eyes. Silence. Then a woman, an elder, spoke. You don't need to explain. You just need to stay. We've had enough men run when truth shows up. Brent did stay. Week after week. Not as a savior. Not as a hero. But as someone rebuilding from rubble, one truth at a time. He volunteered at youth centers. Not to erase his past, but to own it. He joined de-escalation training teams, not to teach, but to learn. He testified before the city council, not to be forgiven, but to prevent repeats. He no longer flinched at Maya's name. He whispered it like a prayer. Not because he admired her, but because she had done what he had never dared. Hold up a mirror to a man convinced he was justice itself. By the end of that year, Brent Wallace wasn't Officer Wallace anymore. He was just Brent. And that, finally, was enough. It wasn't just about the badge. It was never just about the courtroom. It was always about the ripples. The ones that start small, just a voice speaking up in the face of arrogance, a woman standing tall in a room built to make her feel small. But those ripples, they don't stop at the surface. They keep moving. They touch lives. They shift cultures. They change futures. In the months following the case, Maya Ellis never once claimed victory. She never gave press conferences, basking in applause. She simply returned to her office, surrounded by law books and case files, and got back to work. Because for her, justice wasn't a headline, it was a habit. But the world noticed. Young black girls began writing letters. "Miss Maya, I want to be a lawyer like you. I used to be scared of courtrooms. Now I want to walk into one with my head held high. Mama says your story gives her hope." Maya never expected to become a symbol. But in every quiet moment, on a park bench, in a school visit, during a quiet evening walk, she felt the eyes of a world waking up. People didn't just see her as a woman who won. They saw her as a woman who stood. Stood when it was risky. Stood when it was uncomfortable. Stood even when her voice trembled. She was invited to speak at universities, police reform panels, and town halls. But she didn't speak like a hero. She spoke like someone who still believes in people. "There is no such thing as a perfect system," she'd say, "but there are always perfect moments to make it better. And those moments belong to all of us." And slowly, change began to take root. A precinct revised its complaint process. A training program was launched to address racial bias, featuring real stories, not statistics. A judge who once scoffed at youth initiatives started funding them instead. The system didn't transform overnight. It never does. But it began to listen. Because someone had demanded to be heard. But perhaps the most beautiful legacy wasn't in courtrooms or policies. It was in conversations. In families, neighbors, friends, sitting together, asking each other harder questions. What does justice mean to you? Have I ever made someone feel small? What can I do differently, starting today? That's how change lasts. Not with the fall of one man. But with the rise of many hearts. One summer evening, Maya stood outside a local school auditorium, watching a young girl deliver a speech at a student-led justice assembly. She was about 10. Bright eyes. Loud voice. "My hero is a lawyer," she said, "because she showed me that sometimes, the strongest person in the room, is the one who chooses kindness when they could choose revenge." Maya smiled, hand over her chest. No one in that room clapped harder than her. In another part of the city, Brent Wallace, no longer a man with a badge, watched the same clip from a small community center. He said nothing. Just nodded once, and let a quiet tear fall. Not out of shame. But gratitude. Gratitude for second chances. Gratitude for being broken, then rebuilt. Gratitude for people like Maya, who don't just fight for justice. They fight to remind us we're still worthy of it. So what do we take from all this? That courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes, it walks silently into a room full of doubt and says, "I belong here." That justice isn't just a system, it's a decision. Made by you. By me. By anyone brave enough to stand, even when it's hard. And most of all, that love, yes, love, is the final answer. Because when you strip away the power plays, the prejudice, the uniforms, and the fear, what's left is the truth. We all just want to be seen, heard, respected, and loved. So if this story moved you, let it move someone else, too. Like this video if you believe in standing up for what's right. Share it with someone who needs to feel hope again. And don't forget to subscribe, not just to this channel, but to the idea that stories can heal, inspire, and transform. This isn't just content. It's a cause. And you? You're part of it now. Thank you for being here. We'll see you in the next story. Until then, stay strong. Stay kind. And never, ever underestimate the power of one voice.